Good evening and welcome to NycosRPG. This is Jonathan Albin, and we have a new format, a new way of doing things. And before we get going, if you haven't yet, follow this show. I trust you'll be wanting to watch this every night, and we've got all kinds of new information to share with you. And if you want to know more information, check out Nykos at patreon.com/Nykos. All right, so let's get started, shall we? Alrighty, so the first portion of the show from this episode going forward is going to be called Opening Salvo. It's going to be rapid fire broadcasting of the things that we're going to talk about today. In particular, tonight we're going to be talking about the law. And you'll see that this episode themes are going to be linking the story pieces that used to be individual segments into one master show. At the same time, it's also going to give us an opportunity to have clear identifying markers at the end and the beginning of each section. So again, with this being the very first one, make sure that if you haven't yet, hit the buttons to like and subscribe, because this is going to be a go-to place for you for information on how to make your game sessions better and to make your presentation the way you want it to be. Alrighty, so let's get started, shall we? The law. It is the bugaboo of most games, is that you have to have rules. You have to have some means of expressing what the boundaries are in terms of mechanics. Some games go into the actual physics of how things work. I was interested to find out that the new D&D 2024 specifically says that the rules aren't the rules. I was watching a video earlier too that talked about the very fact that it is not the rule set that is that defines the game, but rather it is the code by which the game operates. Very interesting, but it also kind of belied the difference between what I would call rules as written and rule of cool. And I think that the person that was talking about it he was using the word reify to talk about the fact that you want to reify your games, and that means to bring reality to your sessions. And I think that's really the definitional line between rule of law versus rule of cool. Those players, I just realized my lighting is poor tonight. Give me just a second to fix that. I'll be right back. One of the wonders of live streaming is that I can actually do that, step out, fix the lighting, make changes or whatever, and it just shifts the starting point. Of course, that's mainly because we still have to build a consistent viewer base on Twitch, and I understand that because we have been doing traditionally shorter format shows, and I think we're going to find more success as we're able to stay on for longer with the longer formats. So as I would say in an earlier video, we're going to cut and then we're going to cut back and we'll start this section over again. But I wanted to clarify what was going on for those of you that might have been watching or listening in this version. Alrighty, welcome to Opening Salvo. This section of the show is or will be episodically my matter of fact, let me just stop telling you about it and just start doing it. Rules. We all love them, we all hate them, and we all understand we have to have them. Whether we're talking about our culture, our nation, or whether we're talking about what happens on at the tabletop. The game is what we make it, and the game is defined by the rules that we play by. The concept of rules, of course, is a variable. It doesn't depend specifically on any given set of rules, but it can actually be a collection or a hybrid thereof. As a matter of fact, you've probably heard me use the two terms rule of law and rules as written, RAW, or the rule of cool, ROC. And some people argue back and forth on which way is a better way to play. And I think that the reason for that differentiation between the two is that there is a concept wherein the role-play game is itself a game first, and then you play roles in it. Or conversely, it is about the drama of the roles, and you happen to use game mechanics to resolve those issues in game. And so the variation between those two ends of the spectrum provide us with a difficult condition, which is what we want. I have heard players that get frustrated in a game session because the rules are not being played by rules as written standards, and they are concerned with the reality. They want their game to be as real as possible. And at the same time, those people who want that narrow definition as rules as on the piece of paper are also finding themselves at a challenge, because there are players who conversely say, well, my game is more real because it's more visceral, and whether or not there's a rule to fill it, we make it make sense in terms of realism. Both of them are bandied about equally, and I'm here to kind of take a middle ground. I believe that the concept of the game that we play in a role-playing game has more to do with understanding or giving place for the spirit of the rules rather than the letter of the rules to exist. And I think that's really the difference. So today we're going to be looking at both ends of that spectrum. We're going to talk some early on about the actual law of Nykos, that is, the things that in the lore became the adjudication of in-game legal matters. And then we're going to take a completely different stance when we go to dealing with the etiquette, those unspoken laws of role play, and how they bear out in any role play game situation, and particularly perhaps focusing a little bit on NycosRPG. Now, I'm not intending for this conversation to become a us versus them, or a me versus you, or a rules written versus rule of cool kind of a conflict. So just realize that I utilize those terms to give defining boundaries. And I think the two symbols here that flip back and forth on the sides of my screen are perfect examples of that. The idea that the rule of cool takes precedence in certain ways, and the rules as written fill in the gaps. And so as you play through, and if you don't understand something that's going on in the game, you can reach to the top and figure out what's really useful. And at the same time, you might therefore downplay the actual rules written, or the rule as written might be able to explain something more clearly than the rule of cool. And so this push me, pull you effect that you fundamentally see on my screen, I think kind of catches that concept pretty clearly, that yes, there's a graduation between the advances of one and the fall of the other, so that push me, pull you effect really does bring the game back to its center between those two. Alrighty, we have gone through our opening salvo, so now we're going to take a little trip. Welcome to Nykos Game Master's Soapbox. I'm Jonathan Albin, and we are going to be talking about tabletop etiquette. And this term, of course, comes from the French term for a ticket, and you had to make sure you followed the rules in order to go to these parties. But the idea of tabletop etiquette is going to be things that are held to in role-playing that it works really well in my games, and I think they'll also work well for you. So if you have any comments about any of these rules or etiquette points, I would love to hear them. So make sure you leave me a comment. If you're here online with me and want to ask any questions, feel free to do that as well. But we're going to just go through these kind of rapid fire because I want to get on to the final topic for the night. So dealing with tabletop etiquette, we're going to start with the fact that most of the games that I run today are professional. And by that, I mean I get compensated for running events. Now, there are a lot of people out there that would poo-poo that or say that game masters shouldn't earn or whatever. But when you consider that I have 50 years continuous experience behind the shield, you might see where the games that I run might have a higher quality value, might have a more gravitas to them than the average person. And therefore, if you were in your career, just consider it this way, if you were in your career for 50 years, don't you think you'd be worth even a few dollars per session? I think so. So the main thing to realize that from this stems my first statement here, and that is that you need to maintain professional intensity when you're a game master. That doesn't mean that you become a bully. That doesn't mean you become a strong arm. It means that you treat your play sessions as sacrosanct. You don't carry in some baggage from your own personal life. You don't bring in anything like, well, we'll talk about it here in a second. But the idea here is that you bring a level of intensity to the game so the players know that when they're there to get things done within the campaign. Now, I know that sounds silly. We're talking about a game after all, and for those of you that have never played role-play games, you look at the group of people sitting at the table and say, you're all making believe, you're all pretending. But the idea is that we're pretending in a framework that is a, quote, real world to us, and therefore we need to stand to that principle when we're playing role-play games and maintain that level of professionalism. That's just more about the ethics of structure. We'll go more into that later. And as you know, I'm dealing with ROC, RAW, and we'll come to that in a minute. Next thing is to talk about those subjects that are off limits. And I have to say that these are really ancient rules. I'm not making up something new here. It used to be, and now I can take my teeth out and talk like an old man. Back in my day, when we used to run role-play games, we didn't talk about politics, religion, sexuality, sexual choices. We didn't talk in general. Those topics were absolutely off limits, off the table. Nobody talked about their religious backgrounds. Nobody talked about their political affiliations. No one talked about who they were sleeping with. That was simply off the table. We just didn't bother with it. Now, I have to say that my transition time over 50 years of playing meant that, yes, I was involved with the period known as the Satanic Panic. Yes, I was involved with the periods where there were religious ambushers that would join games groups to try to prove their evil intention and all of that. And there were even times when legal authorities would get involved with game sessions because of rumors being spread by other people. But just realize that generally speaking, in that older time, these subjects were off limits. And I think it really has to do with what is polite. Our world has lost this concept. The idea of being polite now only means to say yes, please, and thank you. And it doesn't include even the propriety of recognizing the value of being of one sex or another. And it became problematic over time because there were a lot of issues that our culture needed to handle. So those areas became soft limits. And what I mean by that is, yeah, you could talk about who somebody was with, or you could talk about their family backgrounds. You could talk perhaps about their relationships. You might even talk about work, heaven forbid, for a few minutes each session. But generally, these topics were frowned upon as being topics for proper game and discussion. And I kind of hold to this day. I personally wrestle with some of the gender identities only because I'm old enough that I calls them as I sees them, so to speak. And in every case, when I've had somebody of a gender fluid or a gender neutral or a gender unknown, I did everything I could to make sure they felt comfortable. And I've had players of virtually any stripe at my table, so it really doesn't much matter. The next one I think is probably the biggest challenge that I can actually blame on the internet, and that is the idea of speaker sovereignty. It used to be that the games group would assign somebody to be the group leader, and it wasn't that they were warlords or overlords to the game sessions, but they were merely the person who spoke the most clearly and could convey information rapidly, and so they became what was at that time historically known as the caller for the group, and that's CALLER, not COLLAR. But the caller for the group was actually exercising speech sovereignty, and this is something that has become problematic in our modern era simply because nobody respects those kind of boundaries any longer. I've tried a couple of times to invoke a speaker caller relationship in my game sessions, and it simply doesn't work. The individual human has taken the very concept of rights, freedom of speech to the nth degree, not realizing that the concept of freedom of speech has more to do with the type rather than the manner of your speech. But I digress. So what I have done is, with certain groups, I created a speaker stick. In certain cases, I had an icon that I would pass around, and so people could hold that item while they were speaking, and no one else was, in theory, supposed to be interacting, until that fell apart as well with later groups, and to the point now where I have to kind of throw up my hands. But I do fundamentally demand that the players try to speak one at a time, and if they become too cacophonous with the noise, I simply shut down. I don't move anything. I don't quit anything. I just stop engaging with them and start engaging with the creation of the backstory and the expansion of what is known. And this usually catches their attention. The main thing is that you want to be able to, in your game session, encourage people to be encouraging, optimistic, and supportive in their roles as characters in the game, so that when a certain player is on the hot seat and having to deal with the actual role-playing conversationally, the other players are not intentionally running over that person, but are only goading them on and trying to help them to accomplish whatever is going on in the conversation. And that has led to the much more open table that I have now, which we will talk about perhaps at another time as well. But this encouraging, optimistic, and supportive talk doesn't mean you have to throw away the baby with the bathwater. You can still have your petty animosities and your actually fun, healthy competition within your group. But it does also tie into the next point, and that is we need to establish, and in my games in particular, I have established a timely and orderly die rolling process. And that doesn't mean I tell them how to roll their dice, but rather that they can request a die roll or suggest a die roll, but it's fundamentally up to the storyteller, game master, to determine when those dice rolls are required, and then to establish the values of the die rolls through multiple players seeing the dice being rolled, and therefore allowing for a much more clear identification. I also require them to provide me with not only the die roll value, but what they were targeting as a die roll value. Now, that only makes sense in terms of NycosRPG, so I'm not going to go into that, but the equivalent would be to say I rolled a 15 and I needed a 14, or I rolled a 16 and I needed a 15. The idea is that you give a clearly identifiable success-failure bracketing, which is necessary for NycosRPG. One of the other things that took me until this last decade or so, and that was the understanding that we need to self-impose cell phone exile. And early on, it was more difficult because people who had cell phones and people who had pagers were those people who dearly needed them. Their occupation was firefighter or lawyer or something, and therefore they had to be on call at any given time. But generally speaking, I still imposed on anybody who wasn't in that condition to put aside their mechanical devices for the duration of the game for three reasons. Number one is obviously it's rude to talk on the phone when you've got other people around. Number two, it's distracting when you're clicking and typing on your keyboard when it's not your time at the table to talk. And number three, I didn't want players looking up information on the internet to try to, quote, guess where my plot line was going. And so therefore I imposed fundamental cell phone exile during the sessions. Now the players still were able to afterwards do anything they want, but at the table at least there was peace. And this, of course, is a critical area in today's world where everybody lives on their cell phones and fundamentally use their cell phones in a way to be their memory amplification or their note taking for their character or their background information receptacle for their note taking might actually be their phone. So it's a lot harder to impose a cell phone exile. Now, in my case, I put my phone away, and it's only in a very rare situation will I need to pull up something on the phone. But for the most part, it's a much more peaceful world if the phones are all put in a wooden box and nobody bothers them. So now we get down to the open table, and said I'd talk about it earlier, but the concept of the open table is that I don't use a GM screen any longer. I don't use anything but a die rolling tray and my trusty dusty D100. And I say trusty dusty as I'm looking around on my table because it was here. Aha! So I use a monstrous metal D20, and yes, my players know of it as heavy metal, and it's one of the later versions where the sides are not congruous, but the surface area of each space is identical so that the percentage die roll mechanism is maintained. And that leads to a questioning of the metagame transition. When players are in a dynamic situation where all the players are involved and they are all in the scene and they are all interacting with the non-player personalities, what I call NEPs, or non-enjoined persons, pardon me, they have the obligation to maintain being in character and not to share or disturb the group with conversations that are outside of the game. But there are times when a player might get confused enough that they need to have the others in their group assist them in making those decisions and determining how to best communicate with the NEPs in the scene. In which case I authorize the use of the metagame environment. And so we had to come up with a clear means for defining the metagame transition. So we determined that the phrase "in the meta" was itself not words that were spoken in character, but once you invoked the phrase "in the meta," then you could talk freely with everybody in the group and ask them for clarification. Perhaps somebody might remember better. Pardon me. Some people might remember better what happened in a given situation, and therefore the player who is on the hot seat needs to ask other people for clarification of what they do or don't know. And therefore this metagame transition became a very smooth way of transiting from in-game to out-of-game. And so then the player would say, okay, back in-game, and then we could proceed on. And this metagame transition allowed the people at the table, even though they weren't in the scene, to even take notes on it because they were acting functionally as the extended memory of the persona at the table, so that the character could depend on his friends to remind him of things he should know. And by developing a clear metagame transition, you can catch very humorous situations where a player has a very decided opinion in character and then makes an outburst that really should have been in the meta, But because we have a clearly defined protocol, I'm sorry, you didn't say in the meta, so that those words stand. And I know I'm going to get comments, and I really have actually embraced them. Please let me know if you find a problem with this, because I'll try to argue my case. But the players who challenge this say, well, that's a gotcha moment. But if you made it clear and you defined the metagame's steps, then a player who's clear-headed would still be able to follow them, and therefore the comedy of a failed transition it makes for actually enjoyment in the game. So I'm not going to fault it, because that leads to our final point here. And that is, despite all of this feeling like law and establishing must, I'm not. I'm actually trying to maximize fun in all the aspects of the game. I want to make it so that the players are getting their money's worth for the adventure that they've paid for. I'm trying to keep us off of topics that could lead us to cloud our minds about each other. I'm trying to limit the over familiarity that can occur when players interact about their relationships and such. I can tell you from a period of time in the past that I was involved with several relationships that were, shall I say, messy. And had I not had these kind of boundaries in play, my game could have been dragged into some very serious domestic issues and stuff. So I have to say I hold to these more as guidelines, but I also hold to them pretty sternly when it comes to the things that would be. I'm like, I guess you'd say I'm like a Papa Bear. I'm going to protect all of the members of my family, my clan, and so players messing with each other is completely out of the question. But I'm also making sure that we maximize fun by having an encouraging environment where people can try new things, experimental things. We try to be timely and orderly in our die rolling, so there's no big confusion or efforts by an individual to cheat or break the system. We also use the exiling of the cell phones more as a unifying thing than a despairing kind of thing. Just simply make it a more cohesive games group. And same with the metagame rules, to try to make the game as maximally entertaining as possible. And so with this, we've completed my conversation on tabletop etiquette, and this is the closest I think you'll see me come to rules as written. And these are not. These are simply my recommended guidelines. As my grandfather would say, you do what you want. You do what you need. And I'll do what's necessary. So thank you for paying attention to this part. We're now going to move on to the next portion of this. We're coming to the end of the matter. And when we come down to the end of the matter, these are the keys that are really most important. If you're not having fun in your game session because of one of these earlier dynamics, feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll help to make some recommendations specifically for you. I am a paid professional, so that if you have additional information you'd like to get, you can check out patreon.com. You can also find out about the live sessions that I run at NycosRPG.com. And you also can subscribe to this channel, whether it's on Twitch, which gets you free from commercials, or on YouTube, which helps to keep this show a daily channel. Or you can become part of our community over at patreon.com/Nykos. The end of the matter is rule of law, rules as written, rule of cool. Between them, somewhere between these moving dichotomies, these two moving blocks, we have to have a concept of having a great time in a well-defined world that we all can appreciate. And I'm here to help you make your world as amazing as mine is. little hubris there, I suppose. But again, thank you for your time. This is NycosRPG. I'm Jonathan Albin. We are here Monday through Friday. No, I'm going to change that. Every day from 10 a.m. At 10 a.m. and at 11 p.m. with the exceptions of Saturdays, because I have a games group. So Monday through Friday, and actually should have said it this way, Sunday through Friday from 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Saturdays on at 11 p.m. only. And every session is dedicated to helping bring your games together. Now, I am doing some shorts that are intended to be funny. If you watch one of them and are taken aback by it, feel free to reach out to me. But generally, I'm trying to make humor. I'm not trying to make anybody angry. So thank you for all of that. Check out our videos over at our YouTube channel, which is at NycosRPG. And hopefully you'll find something that you can watch there. I believe I've got almost 800 videos right now. So I think there's a few things you could watch over there. Otherwise, I hope to see you again next time. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been NycosRPG.